Hello, I'm Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, and welcome to the Inclusive Employer Handbook webinar series. By being here, you demonstrate the value you place on an inclusive workplace. Thank you for that commitment. You realize that work environments inclusive of people with disabilities tap an underutilized talent pool and help us ensure that we leave no Ohioan behind. Immediately after being sworn in as governor, I established Ohio as a disability inclusion state and model employer of individuals with disabilities because I believe in equal opportunities. As we provide workplaces that offer a sense of belonging, we support improved performance and growth. These webinars will help you provide an inclusive workplace, recruit, hire, and support employees with disabilities, better understand workplace accommodations, and make work sites accessible. Best wishes for your efforts to foster an inclusive workplace. And thank you. Thank you for your effort to make Ohio a better, stronger, more inclusive place for everyone.
And thank you, Governor DeWine, for encouraging employers to recruit and support their employees with disabilities. Hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Schwab, and I am a career development specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you back to the Inclusive Employer Handbook 5-part webinar series for the second session titled Recruiting, Hiring, and Supporting Employees. Julie, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Dustin, and hello, everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. My name is Julie Wood. I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I am also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. One of my responsibilities at the agency is to provide education and resources for employers on a variety of topics that relate to disability inclusion and accessibility in the workplace. So one of the ways I do this is through monthly webinars like the one we are hosting today, and all of our webinars are then archived on the employers page of our website, so you can access them on demand at your convenience.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a learner's guide and a helpful fact sheet, which can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information that we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope that this information is helpful for you. We'll be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and then again before we conclude to answer any questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so that they're ready for us when we stop. In our last webinar, we discussed the many advantages to employers who hire individuals with disabilities, such as improved morale, increased productivity, and a better financial position. And we shared many strategies for creating a workplace culture that is inclusive of people with disabilities. Today, we are discussing how employers can further adopt a disability inclusive culture through the efforts they make to recruit, hire, and support employees. Julie, what topics will we cover?
Dustin, today's conversation is focused on how employers can attract and support qualified individuals with disabilities. And so we will discuss the goals employers have for hiring, ways to make the recruitment process inclusive, the importance of communicating the right to reasonable accommodation, how essential functions contribute to the hiring process and performing the job. And then we will share best practices for making the hiring process accessible.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, let's talk about how establishing hiring goals can be beneficial for employers.
Dustin, the results of a survey in 2017 from the Kessler Foundation revealed 57% of those employers who responded had goals for hiring qualified, diverse individuals. However, only 28% had goals for hiring qualified individuals with disabilities. As you mentioned, there are benefits that come with employing individuals with disabilities. These can include things like increased problem-solving skills and innovative thinking, improved morale, increased productivity, and decreased turnover, all of which have a positive impact on an employer's bottom line. However, the unemployment rate for individuals with disabilities is more than double the rate for individuals without disabilities. So, one important way employers can tap into this valuable and underutilized talent source is to establish a goal for hiring qualified individuals with disabilities. Employers who are intentional about recruiting, hiring, and supporting individuals with disabilities are more likely to attract qualified candidates for their open positions and increase their chances of finding the best person for the job. And of course, it's helpful to establish a way to track this goal so you know if you're successful. Dustin, some of the employers who applied for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award shared the hiring goals they have specific to individuals with disabilities.
Yes, at least 2 employers indicated the number of employees with disabilities they planned to hire, and they were specific to say their goals were organization-wide and not just for specific departments or positions. Both employers also mentioned the number of employees they had hired to meet their goals. Okay, Julie, having a goal to hire qualified individuals with disabilities is a great start. But next, employers can utilize inclusive strategies to recruit individuals with disabilities to apply for their open positions.
That's right, Dustin, and this includes being proactive to attract qualified candidates with disabilities. Employers can be intentional about this by recruiting for their open positions with sources that include candidates with disabilities, like OOD. Employers can also share their open positions with colleges and universities and participate in disability-focused hiring events.
Julie, let's start with recruiting from sources that include candidates with disabilities. We know each state has a vocational rehabilitation agency that works with individuals with disabilities related to their employment goals. In Ohio, that is our agency, Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. One way that we empower Ohioans with disabilities is through facilitating individualized employment plans to assist individuals with meeting their job goals. To support this, OOD has many services available for employers to help them recruit and retain qualified individuals with disabilities. Do you want to explain the work that we do here to help employers recruit candidates with disabilities?
Sure. So we have a team of 5 business relations specialists, which we refer to as BRSs. They establish partnerships with employers in Ohio who want to expand their hiring pool and attract qualified candidates with disabilities, and who are striving to make their workplaces more accessible and inclusive. Our BRS team helps employers meet their goals by sourcing qualified candidates with disabilities for their open positions, providing hiring events that include qualified candidates with disabilities, which we will hear more about briefly from Cynthia Cruz, our BRS in the Southwest region of Ohio, and by delivering a variety of interactive presentations geared toward making the workplace inclusive. We included contact information for our BRS team, plus a service map in the learner's guide, so employers can quickly find the BRS who serves their area. This information can also be found on the employers page of our website. Dustin, employers might also consider partnering with colleges and universities to find qualified candidates for internships, co-ops, and entry-level positions that require some education. This is your area of specialization at OOD. How can employers get involved with this talent source?
Well, many employers have relationships with career services offices at the universities with which they work closely. However, employers who are prioritizing the inclusion of individuals with disabilities might benefit from developing relationships with the Disability Services Office. Students might utilize the Disability Services Office for accommodations, but they might not take advantage of the supports that are offered by career services. Therefore, working directly with this office will help employers reach additional students and graduates with disabilities. Specific academic programs can also advertise jobs to their students. By working with these departments, the employers can reach students who will likely meet their education requirements. For example, an employer looking for a public relations intern might benefit from reaching out to the college's communications and journalism departments to advertise their openings.
Dustin, I know OOD also partners with colleges and universities throughout Ohio. Can you explain how our employer partners can utilize their relationship with OOD to recruit college students and graduates with disabilities?
Yeah. Ohio College to Careers is a program of OOD that helps connect college students and graduates with disabilities with internships and careers that align with their majors or employment goals. We work with 17 colleges and universities throughout Ohio. Therefore, we can work with employers to source qualified candidates for internships as well as for full-time careers. We also work with students on their resumes and interview skills so that they are prepared as much as possible for employers with available positions. Agency-wide, OOD supports college students at any college and university in Ohio.
Dustin, another way employers can be inclusive with their hiring practices is by hosting inclusive internships. Can you explain these and the benefits they may have for employers?
Absolutely, Julie. So for this webinar, when we discuss inclusive internships, we mean internships that are designed with the intention of hiring individuals with disabilities. Some employers have autism to work internships for which they look for candidates with autism. Other employers host internships that are designed to include individuals who have any disability. Again, to find candidates for these positions, employers work with disability services offices at colleges and universities and Ohio College to Careers. Some employers even have special links to career pages that are specifically designed to indicate that a candidate with a disability has applied. These employers then work with organizations that serve individuals with disabilities to ensure their candidates have access to the dedicated links. Inclusive internships provide individuals with disabilities the opportunity to gain professional experience and network within their chosen field. For employers, these opportunities help them to represent their customer base and the communities that they serve. They also provide the opportunity to increase their talent pools. Many employers offer full-time employment to their interns after the completion of their internship. The majority of students who are offered positions accept them. Therefore, employers who hire interns are likely to have candidates for full-time positions within this group of interns.
Dustin, if an employer does not currently offer internships but would like to, can OOD help employers develop these?
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up, Julie. College to Careers has helped employers design internship programs with the intention of being inclusive. We can offer any level of assistance in which an employer might be interested. Some employers have asked us for information on the majors and career goals of the students that we serve. We can provide this information to employers who might need help deciding where to house their internships or what fields might be of interest to our students. We can also help with internship structure if this is of interest to employers, whether that means time of year, number of hours, location, or other elements. Julie, you can help employers who might be interested in ensuring aspects of their internships are as accessible to as many students as possible. And we've mentioned previously that when an employer is ready for candidates for an internship program, we can certainly help source qualified candidates to them.
Dustin, thanks for all this great information about internships.
No problem, Julie. College to Careers also hosts opportunities for employers to connect with students and graduates with disabilities through career and internship spotlights each semester. Additionally, OOD hosts hiring events in which we include our College to Careers students when they are interested.
We do, and the topic of hiring events rounds out our discussion of ways employers can make their recruitment process inclusive. For those employers who wish to attract qualified candidates with disabilities for their open positions, one great idea is to participate in disability-focused hiring events, and OOD offers a variety of options for employers. In fact, one of the employers who applied for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award indicated they have participated in our events and have hired nearly 50 candidates per event. To tell us more about these events, we invited our colleague Cynthia Cruz to join us.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Cruz, OOD Business Relations Specialist for Southwest Ohio. I'd like to tell you about the hiring events OOD offers for employer partners. In addition to sourcing candidates for your openings throughout the year, we also offer disability-focused hiring events. In the past, we have hosted live hiring events with in-person interviews and large-scale job fairs. These job fairs ranged anywhere from 100 to 300 plus attendees with disabilities, with a range of educational backgrounds and experiences. Currently, we offer multiple virtual hiring events throughout the year. These events are typically scheduled for a 2 to 4 hour period in a single day and may focus on a specific industry. For example, work from home opportunities, a specific region of the state, or an employer that has a statewide presence. OOD will pre-screen candidates and share their resumes prior to the event, and will schedule the virtual interviews using the Microsoft Teams platform. The intent of these events is to provide our employer partners with a full slate of qualified candidates who are ready for immediate hire with your company. Won't you join us in the next one?
Great idea. Thank you, Cynthia. Okay, Julie, last month we talked about reasonable accommodation statements, which communicate to individuals with disabilities their right to an accommodation when needed to participate in the hiring process or at work. How can employers use these statements to recruit, hire, and support employees?
Dustin, the reasonable accommodation statement is key to an inclusive workplace and can certainly help employers support candidates and employees with disabilities. The first step is to develop a reasonable accommodation statement. If you are looking for ideas of what to include, we provided an example and a resource from the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, in the Learner's Guide. The next step is to communicate the right to reasonable accommodation. Under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations for qualified individuals with disabilities to access the hiring process, perform the job, and enjoy the benefits of employment. But not all individuals know of this right, or if they do know, they may be reluctant to request an accommodation out of concern they may be discriminated against for needing one. So by posting your reasonable accommodation statement in key locations, you are communicating this right under Title I and sending the message that you are an inclusive employer who cares about what individuals with disabilities need to access the hiring process and to participate in the workplace. Some of the key locations to include this statement are in job descriptions, job postings, application forms, reasonable accommodation policies, employee handbooks, on the internet, and in any invitation for an event like interviews, onboarding, meetings, trainings, and conferences. And you want to make this statement easy to find. For example, instead of placing it at the end of a lengthy application for a job, post it in the very beginning. Beyond this, it's important to regularly train your employees on the right to reasonable accommodation. Most employers do this as a part of their onboarding process. It's also important to train all employees about this on a regular basis. Some employees may not currently have a disability, but acquire one through an injury or an onset of a medical condition. So continually reminding employees about the right to reasonable accommodation is a very important way you can support what your employees need and retain a talented and experienced workforce.
Thank you, Julie. And we've included this resource in the Learner's Guide as well. So let's take a break here and see if we have any questions, which we do have some questions that were pre-submitted with registration forms. So we're going to answer some of those, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box as well. So Julie, the first pre-submitted question that we have is someone said they're looking for resources for managers.
Yeah, that's a great point to talk about. So the research shows us that most often an employee who needs an accommodation is going to request this of their supervisor or ask their supervisor instead of going to HR. So it's important to inform your supervisors of their role to help you fulfill your obligations under Title I so that they recognize that request, they know to connect that person with HR to begin your interactive process right away, but also to help supervisors understand their role in helping HR to identify an effective accommodation, because the supervisor knows the work environment and the essential functions of that job really well. So they can be a great support in finding a solution. They can also be a great support in implementing the accommodation, whether it's equipment or a change of schedule. So we've created a webinar specifically for supervisors and their role with navigating Title I of the ADA. That is archived on our website, so it's available on demand, and you can find that on the employers page.
Awesome. And what virtual events are scheduled or being scheduled that employers can participate in 2022?
So we are continuing with offering a webinar each month. Right now we are in the second session of the Inclusive Employer Handbook. We have 5 scheduled, so we'll have one relating to this handbook through May, and then we have the next series of webinars in the works, so we'll be announcing those soon. We have virtual hiring events scheduled throughout the year, so you are welcome to reach out to the business relations specialist in your region to find out more about those. And then Dustin, I know you and your colleague, Kristen Ray, have some events related to the C2C program that you'd like to share.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So each semester we host a career and internship spotlight for the students that are participating in the College to Careers program. And so employers who have internships or careers available for recent college graduates are invited to come to those events and share for 20 minutes, half an hour about the positions that they have available to college students and graduates, which is similar to our business relations specialists also put on spotlights to highlight positions at employer partners throughout the year. And so if you're interested in becoming involved in either of those spotlights, feel free to reach out to your business relations specialist. So another question, Julie, how can leaders create a welcoming environment for those with learning disabilities?
So in session 1 of the handbook, we talked about inclusive workplace, and we shared a lot of ideas and best practices for how to create disability inclusive workplaces. And so I would point you to that webinar for more detailed information. And again, that one is also archived on our website. But some ideas I can share from that. And it really pertains to all disabilities, not just one specific type of disability. But, one way you can do this is by establishing a formal statement from your leadership about your commitment to diversity and disability inclusion in the workplace. Also, a lot of employers and organizations have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And so just recognizing that disability is a part of diversity and including it with those efforts and activities is another way that you can create this welcoming environment. Beyond that, including your equal employment opportunity statement, your reasonable accommodation statement, and all those key locations just continues to reinforce that you care about what your applicants and your employees need in the workplace. And then, something maybe we don't think about as much is if you have a company newsletter or marketing materials, make sure these include people with disabilities. So in your newsletters, incorporate topics about disabilities. In your marketing materials, make sure you include images of people with disabilities. So these are all different ways that you can create an environment that is welcoming for all employees, including employees with disabilities.
Awesome. And how do leaders of organizations become more aware of individuals who may have disabilities?
So what I think we mean about this question is how can we be better informed about this type of disability so we're creating a welcoming environment, we're decreasing barriers, making things accessible. And so when we were reviewing these questions, I know, Dustin, what you mentioned is if we're creating an inclusive workplace, it may foster an environment where an employee feels comfortable to be themselves at work and they might disclose their personal stories, and we learn from each other's experiences. So things could be shared just naturally in that way when you create this culture. Beyond that, if you have an interest in a specific disability type, you could look to see what types of organizations are available in your community or activities and participate in their events and their education to learn more. Even if that information is not specific about the workplace, it's probably education that's transferable to the workplace that could help to inform your culture as well. Beyond that, you could consider creating an employee resource group that's focused on disability. You might identify some needs in the work environment through that kind of effort. And then certainly you are welcome, employer partners, to reach out to me or to your BRS for a worksite accessibility consult if you'd like to talk about a certain disability group in your work environment to discuss how to make it more inclusive and accessible.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you anyone who submitted a question ahead of time. If you have any questions before we're done, we're going to be taking another break at the end of the webinar. And so please feel free to post those questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the rest of the webinar. Julie, I think it's a good idea to next discuss the importance of essential functions and how they help to create an inclusive workplace. I sometimes get confused by the specificity of these. Additionally, this was an area that was occasionally skipped by employers applying for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award. I wonder if some employers already write their essential functions inclusively, but would benefit from some reassurance. So can we start by explaining what essential functions are and what role they play in the workplace?
Sure, Dustin. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, defines essential functions as the basic job duties an applicant or employee with a disability must be able to perform with or without a reasonable accommodation. They're the critical tasks that must be completed to meet the job's expectations, and if they weren't performed, it would fundamentally change the job. They really are a valuable tool in an inclusive workplace, and they have a role in both the hiring process and during employment. How essential functions impact the hiring process begins with applicants. Because these are the basic job duties, applicants rely on them to know if they're qualified for the job. Essential functions can also help in the hiring process by informing what questions you ask candidates during the interview to determine whether they're qualified to perform the job.
And how do they impact employment?
Essential functions are also useful when an employer is evaluating performance and navigating the interactive process. Again, because these are the critical duties of the job, they are tied to performance expectations and how all employees are evaluated on job performance. They are especially useful during the interactive process when the employer and the employee are collaborating to determine an effective, reasonable accommodation. Remember, Title I of the ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities to perform the job's essential functions when they are needed. So to choose an effective accommodation, you need to know what the job's essential functions are. It's a best practice for employers to implement a policy or a strategy for identifying a job's essential functions, describing them inclusively, and posting them in key locations.
Essential functions truly are valuable to an inclusive workplace. So speaking of inclusive, it's important not only to identify a job's essential functions, but also to write them inclusively. Julie, will you share with us how employers can identify these critical job duties and why it's important to write them inclusively?
Sure. So the EEOC regulates and enforces Title I, and its guidance states that employers should examine their job's essential functions before making recruitment efforts, conducting the hiring process, or making employment decisions. The EEOC guidance includes factors and evidence to help employers determine what tasks of a job are essential and what tasks might be marginal or less critical. We included resources in the Learner's Guide that Jan offers about this EEOC guidance and also about how to create job descriptions, because even though they aren't required under Title I, employers often have job descriptions, and these are great places to include essential functions. So Jan offers resources on best practices for both identifying essential functions and creating job descriptions.
We also addressed these resources and additional best practices for employers in our webinar called Essential Functions in the Workplace, that is available on demand on the employer's page of the OOD website and is listed in the Learner's Guide. Julie, what can you tell us about describing essential functions inclusively?
Dustin, a job's essential functions often are written based on the way the job has customarily been performed without giving thought to the outcome of the task. This can result in an applicant with a disability thinking they aren't qualified for the job if they have a disability-related limitation to performing the job in this customary way. However, we know that through the use of a reasonable accommodation, an individual with a disability can often perform the job just as effectively in another way. So to promote the job being inclusive and to attract more qualified candidates for your open positions, it's advised that essential functions are described in an outcome-based way and using inclusive language. This means they are written based on the purpose of the job and not based on the method for getting the job done. We discussed how to write essential functions and shared resources with examples and best practices in our on-demand webinar Dustin just mentioned, which was devoted to essential functions in the workplace. We also included some of those resources in the learner's guide for this training.
So Julie, once an employer has identified their job's essential functions and written them inclusively, where should they utilize them?
Dustin, there are a few key locations to make sure to include essential functions. The first two are in job postings and application forms. These are commonly the first places employers communicate their job openings, and we know an applicant is going to rely on the job's essential functions to determine if they're qualified for the job. Another key location to include essential functions is in your job descriptions, because these are used when hiring professionals are creating interview questions, when candidates are deciding whether they need an accommodation for their new job, when supervisors are measuring performance, and when an employee and employer are collaborating to find an effective accommodation during the interactive process.
These are some of the same places that we mentioned to include the reasonable accommodation statement. And it makes sense because if you know the job's essential functions and you need a reasonable accommodation, you are informed of how to request one. So now we've discussed job postings and application forms. Let's talk more about the hiring process.
Dustin, employers will be better positioned to attract qualified candidates with disabilities for their open positions if they are intentional about making the hiring process inclusive and accessible. So we are going to talk about some aspects of the hiring process to keep in mind, like job postings, job applications, interviews, and onboarding newly hired employees.
Sounds great. Today we've discussed including essential functions, reasonable accommodation statements, and EEO statements on job postings. Last month, we mentioned the importance of posting a formalized commitment to inclusive hiring and using images of individuals with disabilities in marketing materials and career pages. What other suggestions do you have to make job postings more inclusive?
Dustin, just as a reminder, because candidates rely on the job's essential functions to determine if they're qualified, you do want to make sure to include these in the job posting. And including the EEO and reasonable accommodation statements, like you said, help to convey that you are an inclusive employer and informs candidates of how to make a request for a reasonable accommodation if they need one. The other suggestion I have is to make sure your job postings are accessible for individuals with disabilities. For example, if you are posting information about your open positions in on-site locations, make sure they're accessible for individuals with mobility impairments. Most likely you have a career page on your website and post open positions there. So make sure these notices are accessible for a person who is blind and uses screen reading software to receive the information about the job. We talked about this in more detail in our webinar, Inclusive Hiring for Applicants with Disabilities, which is available on demand on our website.
Those are great ideas. I really like an example that we have from an applicant for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award. On their job postings, they state that they have a dedicated support line for candidates with disabilities to call for assistance completing applications. So speaking of applications, these can be tricky for anyone to navigate. What recommendations do you have for employers who are trying to ensure their employment applications are accessible?
Dustin, what's key about the application process is to be intentional about making it accessible for everyone, whether the application is online or in person. And it's a best practice to be prepared to provide reasonable accommodations in case an applicant with a disability experiences a barrier in your application process. So these two strategies help employers to make this part of the hiring process inclusive and accessible. In our inclusive hiring webinar, we shared many ideas for making applications accessible, and since many employers are using online application forms, I'll just share a few ideas now for how to make these accessible. One way is to make sure the application is accessible by a screen reader, which is being used by a person with a visual disability. Another way is to create application forms that are organized and not cluttered, which can help increase focus and concentration. It's important to provide captions for sounds and video that are created by a person and not through artificial intelligence or AI, which we know can cause errors. And one final example is to design your application form to be navigated by using only a keyboard for individuals who may have a limitation with using a mouse.
Those are great tips. So speaking of AI, in our webinar on digital accessibility and accommodations, which can be found on our website under the Employers tab, we discussed applicant tracking systems and artificial intelligence used during interviews. So while doing research for that webinar, we learned that many employers allow hiring managers to override these systems to refrain from screening out candidates who may otherwise be qualified for the positions. And this is a great way to make those processes more accessible. Now, Julie, you mentioned including a reasonable accommodation statement on application forms. Can you review some potential accommodations that might assist candidates with disabilities to complete a job application?
This is a good reminder, Dustin, that the application form is another key location to include your reasonable accommodation statement, because even though you are being intentional to make it accessible, if a person with a disability does encounter a barrier, it's important to inform them of how to request a reasonable accommodation. And then, of course, it's helpful for employers to be prepared to provide reasonable accommodations for the application process. So, although what each applicant with a disability may need is determined on a case-by-case basis, it's still helpful to be familiar with some reasonable accommodations that may be requested. So I'll share a few ideas with you now. If an applicant experiences a barrier with an online application, an accommodation could be to permit the applicant to provide the required information in another way, like through email or telephone. Another accommodation can be to provide print versions of your online application that a person could pick up on site in an accessible location. And one last idea is to be prepared to provide written information in an alternative way, like large print, braille, or an audio format.
Okay, now that the application process is accessible for candidates, we can move on to the interview phase of the hiring process. What is important for employers to know about interviews?
Dustin, Title I calls this part of the hiring process the pre-employment phase, and it further divides this phase into the pre-offer and post-offer phases. Now, we discussed these in more detail in our inclusive hiring webinar, but I want to share some key points now about the pre-offer phase, which includes the interview. The reason Title I splits this phase into two is to prevent hiring professionals from screening out a candidate based on a disability before assessing whether they are qualified for the job. So this means employers are to focus the pre-offer phase, which includes the interview, on the applicant's ability to meet the job's qualification standards and to perform the job's essential functions. To ensure this requirement is followed, Title I states that during the pre-offer phase, employers may not ask disability-related questions or administer medical examinations until a conditional offer of employment is made. Once a formal job offer is extended to a candidate and is accepted, the post-offer phase of a pre-employment begins. And now, if employers plan to ask any disability-related questions or administer medical exams, they can. But these must be required of all candidates who receive a job offer in the same job category.
Let's talk about some best practices to help employers make sure their interview process is accessible and inclusive. Many of these practices apply to hiring managers. Julie, what training might you recommend to employers who want to help their hiring managers in this area?
Dustin, it's helpful to train the hiring professionals that create and review applications and conduct interviews on a variety of topics. First, it's helpful to make sure those professionals involved in the hiring process are trained on Title I of the ADA, so they are informed of the responsibilities employers have under the law, which include prohibiting discrimination based on disability and to provide reasonable accommodations for qualified individuals with disabilities when one is needed. It's important to make sure this kind of training addresses disclosure of a disability and the confidentiality guidelines that must be followed. And I think it's important to train your hiring professionals on reasonable accommodations so they recognize a request for an accommodation, know to direct that to human resources to start the interactive process, and are aware of common reasonable accommodations used in the hiring process. And last, but certainly not least, is the importance of training your hiring professionals on disability etiquette and awareness. This kind of training is twofold. First, it helps us all to learn ways to interact respectfully with people with disabilities. And secondly, it helps to demystify stereotypes, myths and fears about disabilities and can help to remove any unintentional biases hiring professionals may have. To support employers in providing this information, we have an extensive library of on-demand webinars focused on these responsibilities. One we have mentioned often today, which is our inclusive hiring webinar. We have a virtual webinar on disability etiquette. We have a training for supervisors and Title I of the ADA. And we have a 5-part series called the Employer's ADA Handbook.
These are great resources for employers. Aside from training, what else can employers do to support their hiring professionals who conduct interviews to ensure they're inclusive?
Dustin, there are 2 protocols that can be very useful for those professionals who conduct interviews. The first is to create a list of questions ahead of time to ask all candidates that focus on performing the job's essential functions. This can help to prevent unintentionally asking a disability-related question. And the second is provide education on when the interviewer may and may not ask a candidate with a disability to describe or demonstrate an essential function. We talked about this in detail in our inclusive hiring webinar.
Good points. And Julie, let's talk about the reasonable accommodation statement again and accommodations for the interview process.
Dustin, yes, the reasonable accommodation statement is important in this phase of the hiring process too. Once you've identified a candidate you'd like to interview, it's important to include the reasonable accommodation statement in the invitation for the interview. Of course, we are all doing all we can to make sure this entire process is accessible. However, if a candidate with a disability needs an accommodation to have equal access to competing for a job and participating in the interview, you want them to let you know so you can provide a solution. Now, to help a candidate know whether they need an accommodation, it's helpful to include a description of the interview process, whether it's a virtual interview or on-site. And then, just like with the application process, it's important to be prepared to recognize a request and be prepared to provide reasonable accommodations. Part of that includes being familiar with what types of accommodations a person may need to participate in the interview. I'd like to share some ways to make sure interviews occurring in the virtual environment are accessible. One idea is to make sure your platform is accessible for screen reading software. Another is to find out if your platform permits a third party to be present to provide sign language interpretation and real-time captioning. This is another example of a time you do not want to rely on captions generated by AI because of the errors they can make. And an accommodation you may want to be prepared to provide is additional time to view videos that are pre-recorded, complete online assessments, and participate in a panel-style interview. Also, because one common accommodation request is sign language interpretation, whether it's for a virtual or on-site interview, it can be helpful for employers to identify resources that can provide this service ahead of time, so you are prepared when you receive this request and can act quickly without delay to scheduling the interview.
Those are great points to remember. Okay, now that we've made it through the interview, let's move on to onboarding. Julie, what should employers know to ensure new employees are smoothly integrated into their new positions and the culture of the organization?
Well, Dustin, this is another time to be aware of the need for reasonable accommodation. So just like with the interview, once a candidate receives a formal job offer and becomes an employee, employers often send them an invitation to onboarding. In this invitation, you want to include the reasonable accommodation statement and any detailed information about the work environment, the training that will occur in onboarding, the workstation, and the job duties. This information helps the new employee to know whether they need an accommodation and instructs them on how to request one. It's also important to be prepared to receive these requests and to make sure these accommodations are ready for the new employee on their first day of work. To do this, employers can consider assigning an employee to be responsible for receiving requests and facilitating the interactive process. It can also be helpful to train the employees who will implement reasonable accommodations for things like parking, facilities, information technology, security, and the workstation about confidentiality and how to respond to any questions they may receive from other employees about the accommodations they see being implemented in the workplace. This helps these employees be prepared to facilitate accommodations effectively and without compromising confidential information.
Julie, there are a lot of common solutions for reasonable accommodation requests during the onboarding process. Do you want to share a few of these?
Sure. So again, when an employee with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation, what they need is always determined on a case-by-case basis through the interactive process. But there are some common accommodations requested for onboarding that can be helpful to be aware of. Some of these include making sure any forms you are using are accessible. So if these are on your intranet, make sure they are accessible by a screen reader. If they are printed, be prepared to provide these in alternative ways like large print or in an audio format. If your onboarding is occurring on site, make sure the site is accessible for individuals with mobility limitations. Permit the use of service animals. Be prepared to provide a reader or scribe. Make sure any videos or audio content is properly captioned, and provide space that is quiet and free of distractions.
And of course, a job coach can help supplement a new employee's onboarding by providing training beyond what the organization traditionally offers. Julie, onboarding customarily addresses the employer's policies and benefits that apply to all employees.
That's right, Dustin. And as we mentioned before, this is a great time to provide information on the reasonable accommodation policy or procedures the employer follows. Typically, this addresses the right to reasonable accommodation and how to request an accommodation if one is needed. It's important to repeat this training on a regular basis to support all employees. An employee may acquire a disability in the future and need an accommodation to remain working. If this type of training is repeated, the employee will know they can reach out to their employer to ask for what they need at work, which helps employers retain valuable and experienced employees. Often employers take this opportunity during onboarding to address the retirement and savings plans they offer all employees. Sometimes these unintentionally exclude employees with disabilities because investing in these interferes with other benefits these employees receive related to their disabilities. So one option employers have is to offer a financial savings plan for individuals with specific disabilities or employees with family members who live with a specific disability. These types of plans are known as stable accounts. Stable accounts are an incredibly powerful tool for increasing financial security and providing greater independence for people with disabilities. Before, people living with disabilities could only save a total of $2,000 before losing their benefits. With a stable account, earnings grow tax-free and are not subject to federal income tax, so long as they are spent on qualified disability expenses, which include things like education, housing, transportation, healthcare, assistive technology, basic living expenses, and many other items. Employers can help employees contribute to a stable account through payroll deductions. Employers may also choose to further support this benefit by making an employer-sponsored contribution to these plans, similar to how they make contributions for all employees through traditional retirement plans. More information about this benefit can be found in the resources section of the Stable website at stableaccount.com.
Okay, Julie, before we stop for questions, we would like to share with employers one more way we can support them. We mentioned many best practices and guidelines, as well as highlighted several of our on-demand webinars that can be great resources for employers. We also want to make sure that employers know that we offer interactive presentations virtually and in person to support them in recruiting, hiring, and supporting employees with disabilities. So we'd like to hear from our business relations specialist in the Southwest region of Ohio once again to tell us about these training offerings, including one very helpful training that addresses today's topics. Cynthia, take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's me again. In addition to candidate sourcing and hosting hiring events, we also provide a variety of interactive trainings for employers. Our goal with our interactive disability awareness training sessions is to assist our valued employer partners with making recruitment, onboarding, and the overall workplace more inclusive. We do so with a variety of disability awareness education sessions that are crafted specifically for your unique goals, including the employees you desire to train and the timeframes you have available. In order to support your company's desire to create a culture that's reflective of diversity, equity, and inclusion, We have several options in our training portfolio, which can be conducted in person or virtually. This includes Windmills, an interactive training that uses participation and discovery as learning vehicles to help the audience overcome their fears and biases. Other training topics address respectful language and communication tips for interacting with employees with disabilities, a session on invisible disabilities, and the fears, myths, and biases often associated with them, and getting on board with inclusive hiring, a popular interactive training with a life-size board game to help you make your application, interview, and onboarding process more inclusive. All of our trainings help to break down barriers in a friendly and non-threatening manner. We're happy to consult with employers and create the most appropriate and engaging program for you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Okay, let's take one more break to answer questions. So, Julie, it looks like we have some more pre-submitted questions that were sent with the registration. First, often performance reviews are a one-size-fits-all document to measure job performance. So how can a supervisor or a manager best use a performance review to optimize employee performance, especially for employees who have disabilities?
So the performance evaluation typically is a one-size-fits-all because we do want to evaluate everybody's performance the same way if they're doing the same job. When we might deviate from that is if a person is using a reasonable accommodation that alters how they're doing the job in such a way that how we evaluate it also has to fall into alignment with that. But for the most part, we evaluate everybody doing the same job the same way. How this performance evaluation can be a useful tool for employers is when there's low performance, this sometimes will be the first indicator to a person with a disability if their disability is impacting their performance, and that might come out through the conversation about the low performance. The person may disclose a disability at that point and request an accommodation. So it's helpful for those folks who are performing these evaluations to know that that could happen, to recognize that, and to know to connect that person with human resources. The low performance could reveal where a limitation a person has related to their disability is coming across a barrier in the workplace, and it might help us understand what reasonable accommodation could be helpful in enabling that person to perform the job up to its productivity and quality expectations. So the performance evaluation can be a very important tool to helping to uncover what could be an effective accommodation to help a person to be able to perform the job just as effectively in another way. So I think it's good for employers to be prepared in case that conversation comes out of a low performance review.
Great. And what can I look for to ensure my company is representing individuals with disabilities in our hiring process?
So we talked about that a lot today, and we also referenced our inclusive hiring webinar that's available on demand on our website. So you really just want to look at your whole hiring process from, where you recruit for talent. Make sure that where you recruit includes sources that include people with disabilities. We mentioned that OOD puts on hiring events. You want to make sure that from your job posting to your application to your interview and your onboarding that you're trying to be intentional to make these accessible. You're including reasonable accommodation statements and you're being prepared to provide reasonable accommodations. This all communicates that you are an inclusive employer, and it helps communicate to individuals if they happen to need an accommodation how to ask for that to receive it. And so I would just recommend for more information, either, employer partners can always reach out to me for a worksite accessibility consult to talk about your specific work environment. And we also have the inclusive hiring webinar as a reference.
Awesome. So what questions can or can't an employer ask regarding someone's disability? I think it's probably during the interview process.
Yeah, so we touched on this in today's training. We touch on it in a lot more detail in that inclusive hiring webinar that we've referenced frequently. What's important to know is that the EEOC guidance has different rules for different phases. So if you are in the interview phase, which is the pre-offer phase of pre-employment, you cannot ask disability-related questions. If you have made a formal offer, you then can ask disability-related questions, but these have to apply to all candidates who receive the job offer. Once a candidate becomes an employee, the rules change again. You have to have a job-related reason or something consistent with business necessity to be asking these questions. So these would be related to performing the job or health and safety in the workplace. So it's important to know what phase you're in. And in general, a disability-related question is going to be one that could elicit a response that discloses a disability, and that's why you want to be careful about when you're asking for that kind of information.
Awesome. And what questions can or can't an employer ask regarding a service dog in the workplace?
So when we're talking about a service animal in the workplace as a form of reasonable accommodation, you are allowed to ask the same questions you ask any employee with a disability who requests a reasonable accommodation, and you're going through the interactive process. So the interactive process starts with recognizing the request. It then moves on to identifying whether you need medical documentation to verify the disability or the need for the accommodation, and knowing when you're permitted to do so. And then you collaborate with the employee making the request to identify how the limitation related to the disability is being impacted by a barrier in the workplace and what kind of accommodations could remove that barrier to enable access. If that answer is a service animal, then you consider if that's reasonable to incorporate into your workplace. So the reasonable accommodation that's actually being offered is likely a change to your workplace policy that says there are no animals permitted in the workplace. And so you would be going through the process, the interactive process, and asking the same questions that you would of any request. Where this changes is if you're talking about the public coming into your facility and you are asking about service animals related to Title II or Title III. That's when the rules are a little bit more specific about what you can ask. We can provide resources for that. We addressed this in our Accessibility Hour webinar that's archived on the webpage. But basically, from a Title II and Title III perspective, what you can ask is the service animal required because of a disability, and what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? And that's all that you can ask. So
Great.
Hopefully that helps with that.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for everybody who submitted questions. Before we conclude today, Julie, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Dustin. In our first webinar in the Inclusive Employer Handbook, we provided many ways for employers to foster an inclusive workplace. To build on that, in the second session today, we shared many ideas for recruiting, hiring, and supporting employees with disabilities. This includes establishing goals for hiring individuals with disabilities, making sure the recruitment process is inclusive, and then being proactive in making sure the hiring process is both inclusive and accessible, which includes placing that reasonable accommodation statement in key areas and being ready to implement reasonable accommodations when they're needed. We know many employers are already implementing good strategies to achieve these goals. I hope this webinar has inspired each of you to identify the next step you can take to continue creating an inclusive workplace. We very much appreciate your interest in this webinar series, and we are here to support your efforts, so please contact us anytime. And Dustin, thank you.